Before we get started, I just have a few housekeeping notes. First of all, we ask webinar participants to adhere to APSA's Respect campaign. The Respect campaign encourages professional respect by and towards all APSA event attendees and participants at all time. Respect stands for respectful, equitable, safe, professional, and ethical conduct towards all. The APSA Sexual Harassment Survey Report and Anti-Harassment Policy and Code of Conduct address the importance of facilitating a climate of respect at all APSA events. And you can learn more about the Respect campaign and the Code of Conduct on APSA's website. Throughout the event today, please feel free to use the Q&A box to ask any questions. We have some time at the end to address audience questions. We will be recording the event and making it available on APSA's website shortly. And you can enable the closed captioning using the menu option at the bottom of your screen. We are fortunate to have with us today an incredible panel of scholars to discuss campus engagement and civic education. I'm going to introduce our moderator for today's event and hand it over to her to introduce the rest of the panel. Dr. Cherie Strawn is Professor of Political Science at the University of Akron and the Director of the Ray C. Bliss Institute of Applied Politics. Thank you so much for moderating and for everyone for being here today.
Thank you. And thank you, APSA, for giving us this platform. I just wanted to do a brief sort of acknowledgement that of how far we've come as a discipline. When I first started doing this sort of work, I don't know, 20 years ago, about campus engagement and involvement in elections, it was always a struggle to figure out how you were going to count it. You know, if you could do the work and have it count toward tenure, or if it was service that wasn't always valued by your department. You know, having APSA endorse and promote this as something that we should be doing as political scientists, I think is incredibly valuable. And then also we'll have this great learning experience where we can think about things we can do on our own campuses, which is just incredibly important right now, coming up on 2024. And so in order to save time, I thought that what I would do, rather than read everyone's bios, I would go through, and I'll just do this alphabetically in the order, that the alphabetical order of the participants, and have you all introduce yourselves. But while you introduce yourselves and give your institutional affiliation and your role, if you could please also just say, you know, what do you think the most important thing, not everything, but what's the most important thing that you'll be doing to prepare students to vote in the 2024 election, presidential election? And so that leaves us starting with Elizabeth Benyon.
Thank you, Cherie. I have to be off mute to speak. I'm Elizabeth Benyon. I am Chancellor's Professor of Political Science and Director of Community Engagement at Indiana University South Bend, where I also serve as the director of our American Democracy Project. In my role as American Democracy Project leader, I really get to work with fantastic students who are earning either work-study funds or academic credit to participate as democracy fellows. And I think that's really the critical thing that we do to ensure that our campus can carry out a robust, comprehensive campaign to prepare students for the election, looking at voter registration, education, and mobilization. So we really try to map out a calendar, starting with Constitution Day and even Move-In Day and book pickup, where they're always getting information about the election and how they can register. And then we host all kinds of activities for them in terms of Canvas announcements, emails to the entire campus, pre-scripted emails to professors that they can post to their individual classes that are tailored for their disciplines, as well as unstaffed tables, open office hours, both online and in person. And then we move into education. We also have yard signs that our students make and put around campus so that you can't help but see and notice that it's time to register and know what the deadline is. We do use an all-in portal, which is free, so we can track registration behavior, and also they'll get reminders to vote. And then we move into education, which again, we do unstaffed tables, staffed tables, live candidate forums and debates. We do a voter guide. We just have a new addition this year, which is candidate videos from each of the candidates up and down the ballot saying where they stand, the issues that matter to people. And then we do debate watch parties for those things like governor, US Senate, president, have some food, We have small amount of housing, but they're very active folks. And then we open it up to the campus and community. And so all of that, plus a party to the polls before, during early voting, and a parade to the polls on election day where we can actually vote across the street at the local high school, are the way that we move through registration, education, and mobilization. So it's just constantly really sort of present across campus, mostly thanks to the leadership of our students. And increasingly what we're doing is using a lot of social media and Canvas to try to reach our online students, which is a growing segment of students on our campus.
Great. Lots of things happening at South Bend. That leads us to Marcus Board. Can you tell us what you're doing?
Yeah, tough to follow. So hi, my name is Marcus Board. I'm an associate professor of political science here at Howard University. I'm also the chair of the Black Politics Committee. In terms of me personally, I'm working with a group called the Political Science Society. This is an undergrad org. We have over 1,000 undergrad majors here at Howard. And so the goal is to work with that org throughout the summer towards their voter registration and work. In terms of Howard University more broadly, do you want to say that now or do you want us to talk about that later? Go for it. Okay, so Howard has brought in Stacey Abrams as the Ronald W. Walters Endowed Chair for Race and Politics. Stacey Abrams is very well known for her voter registration efforts. She's done some events with students. She plans to continue to do those as far as I know. We're working with Black Girls Vote very often. So that's an organization that is focused on not only Black women voters, but also their unique role in the democratic process. Over 98% of Black women voters vote for the Democratic Party. And so that's just a very important block that they want to make sure to highlight. There's a Howard University initiative on public opinion. They have done a Black Voters Report that they recently released, and that myself and Elsie Scott, who is the director of the Ronald W. Walters Leadership and Public Policy Center, we're going to be talking about that for Research Month on the 26th. And then I'm working on a few shows, one with Howard University TV called Before You Vote. So that's a series that they've done for a few years now, trying to increase voter outreach, particularly among the Black electorate. So those are just a few of the things that both Howard and myself and us together are working on. We're very excited about it.
I had not realized that about Stacey Abrams. That's very exciting. Very exciting.
Yeah, she's cool.
Great. So that leads me to Sekou Franklin.
How you doing? Hi, my name is Sekou Franklin. I'm a professor of political science at Middle Tennessee State University, and thank you for having me. I greatly appreciate it. I also work with some groups here in Davidson County and Nashville and Middle Tennessee area, and I'm the chair of political action for the Tennessee NAACP, and also I work with Free to Vote Coalition of former incarcerated persons seeking their rights to vote. So I'll just say maybe three things, I guess. Well, I'll say that we do have an initiative on our campus to get a polling station on campus. I don't work that closely with the initiative, but we do have that. So in terms of what I'm working on and what I'm working on with some of my students is a voter protection initiative that getting students engaged in triaging voting irregularities, election irregularities with a cadre of different groups that are in Tennessee. Also, as mentioned earlier, Free to Vote Coalition, which is working on voter restoration issues for justice impact people. We ranked second worst per capita in the state when it comes to, in the country when it comes to voter restoration. And that effort is anchored by a group called Free Hearts of Formerly Incarcerated Women. So I've worked with them for about 7 or 8 years in terms of, and have gotten students involved in their activities for the last 5 years or so as well. So we'll be working on that as well. And then also just in terms of you know, my courses have done some voter registration efforts as well. And but in terms of my own personal infusion in this race, I'm also doing some short pieces on the impact of the vote as it pertains to Black people. But I focus not necessarily on those salient flagship legislative issues, but on rules and regulations and the interior of government, how the vote matters in terms of shaping outcomes for African Americans when it comes to rules and regulations in the bureaucracy. Thank you.
Right. I think next time people want you to talk a little bit louder. We had a comment in the just a eat that microphone and speak up a little bit. They were struggling to hear you. So just as we go forward. All right, so that leads me to Connie Jurgensen.
Hi, I'm Connie Jorgensen. I'm Assistant Professor of Political Science at Piedmont Virginia Community College in Charlottesville. I'm also the director of our 5-year plan for civic engagement called Civic Sense, engaging students in the civic lives of their community. In terms of what we're doing, I'll keep it really short. I think the most important thing that we do is our voter guide. It's something now that faculty and students ask for early on in the fall semester, which I love. It's a great way for my political science students to work with journalism students to develop the voter guide, to learn how to be unbiased or to try to be unbiased. It's a great, great, great project. And we also work very closely with our student leadership organizations, the Honor Society and the Student Government Association. They've been very helpful in planning election-related events like get out the vote parties. We can't do it on election day because it's a holiday here at Piedmont. So we always do our get out the vote parties on Monday. And we've had really good luck with it in terms of attendance and getting local public officials to come and speak at the event as well. So that's what I'm most proud of right now.
Great, thank you. And last but not least, Melissa Michelson.
Hi, I'm Melissa Michelson. I'm the Dean of Arts and Sciences at Menlo College out in California. And we're kind of in a unique situation here, I think, because California elected officials and various secretaries of state have done a lot to make voting very easy. So we don't have to worry about making it easy for students to vote. There is a polling place open early voting on campus. And we're a very small campus, so there's really no problem for students voting. You can walk right up to it on election day or during the early voting period without having pre-registered and present your ID and register and cast a ballot. So for me, the most important thing we're doing is convincing students that they should. And especially this year, I think a lot of us are seeing a lot of apathy, a lot of cynicism among our students, dissatisfaction with the folks at the top of the ticket. And so it's more about helping students understand, well, but you do care about Gaza and climate change and LGBTQ rights and racial justice and all of these other things. And if you want to make change on those issues that you care about, that's why you should go vote. And then there's all these other offices on the ballot that you care about. This is something that we heard from a professor at Columbia College in Chicago, Professor Sharon Lloyd-Peshkin made a presentation about this just last week at our working group meeting of the Student Vote Research Network in Chicago last week. And I encourage folks who don't know about that network to join up because we're sharing all kinds of tips about how best to get out the vote. Elizabeth was there sharing her tips about what's going on in Indiana. And so I'm really excited about the work that my students are going to be doing to help students connect the issues that they care about to voting for county supervisor, voting for Congress, voting for these other positions. I'm super excited about that. And before I forget, I have to give a shout out to Black Girls Vote. Marcus, I'm so excited for you that you get to work with Nike and her group. I've been working with them for the past 4 years and they are amazing and I love them. And I know that that's going to really make things at Howard amazing this year.
Great. Okay, so one of the things I wanted to ask about is, voting is on our minds right now, such an important civic act. We got lots of details about what people are doing to promote voting, but we know that this is a long haul, and Melissa's comment just raises that, right? How do we cultivate the intrinsic civic skills and civic identity that keep people involved and engaged beyond voting, so that the voting is the culmination of their activity? And so I'm going to throw this to first Connie and then to Sekou. What do you do to bolster civic knowledge and skills and dispositions in the off years or in between that makes the voter registration drive a little easier? So first, Connie.
First off, I'm from Virginia, and we have elections every year, so there's never an off year here. But one of the advantages to that is we have federal elections in even numbered years and state and local elections in odd numbers years. It gives us more opportunity to focus on those state and local elections. They don't get lost in the noise so much. So we're able to do a little bit more education on why it's important to vote for state delegate or city council or whatever. So while it's kind of a constant challenge in Virginia to do this every year, it does have some distinct advantages. Other things that we do is in our student development course, which all incoming students are required to take, they have to do a module on voting. Which explains to them why they should be voting, how to vote, how to register, all the kind of little details. And hopefully that, I can't really track the effect of that yet, but hopefully it's having an impact. The other things that we do is to try to get students aware of issues that are happening out there. And partially, Melissa, I have the same issue that you do. How are we going to interest people next year when they're already telling me they're not going to vote? They're just going to stay home, right? And hopefully by doing a lot of discussion about issues between now and then, we can add on to that. If this issue, like you said, if this issue is important to you, you've got to vote. But God, if you have any other ideas, please. I'm dying to hear them. Another thing that we do is we require students to take a civic engagement course before they graduate. And this isn't a separate course. Civic engagement has to be included in a regular course in your major. In other words, we weren't allowed to add credits to graduation, right? So, for example, I always use my physics instructors. She's so good. We started this at the beginning of the pandemic, and she was telling me I can't integrate civic engagement into my class. It's physics. It's very defined. I have to get through all this. Yeah, Melissa's like, I know, I know. We've all heard that before. And it was going to be a requirement. And it had to be 25% of the grade. So this is the beginning of the pandemic. And she calls me one afternoon. She says, I've got it. I've got it. She said, we're going to do the physics of a sneeze. So fluid dynamics, propulsion, force, and all that kind of stuff, and connected it to face masks. And I thought that is like the perfect civic engagement project. Now she also takes her students to the Institute for Highway Safety, where they crash the cars with the crash test dummies. It's about 30 minutes north of town. And they use physics to discuss then how physics relates to seatbelt laws and so on and so forth. So we're doing a lot, but not always. It's never enough. So I'm dying to hear what you all are up to. Thank you.
Right. Let's hear from Sekou.
Oh, thanks. And if you can't hear me, just tell me. So, well, in Tennessee, we're in a state where there's a lot of hostility to voting, and we've had 3 waves of attacks against voters, and particularly young people, since 2010, 11. The vote ID wave matched with purging. The second wave was a big attack on voter registration drives, so I had to stop my voter registration efforts for about a year, and then we just fended off a third wave the last few weeks, actually, this past month. So we're in an area where there's, when we see low voter turnout rates, it's not accidental. It's by design and intent. At least in this part of the universe and country. So for my courses, I'm fortunate that we do have an experiential learning component on my in campus. So I integrate experiential learning activities in almost every course I teach. Some of those are part of the experiential learning program. Some of those are not part of the program. So, and a lot of that entails voter registration drives. We've done several in the public housing development close to campus. Although there's displacement going on there, so that's the intersection between gentrification, displacement, and voter turnout. But I have my students very intentional. We attend court watch. We attend parole hearings, city council meetings, county commission hearings. We do, of course, voter restoration work, eviction hearings. So we're trying to give students a holistic understanding of why the vote matters and why participation matters, expanding the notions of democracy, not just in the voting booth, but democracy in the parole hearings, democracy in voting in the workplace, and trying to make that part of the holistic kind of understanding. And I do that from top to bottom. In my undergraduate courses, in my lower division courses, my Intro to American Politics course, most students there have never voted. Most students there have never attended a county commission meeting, city council meeting, any of that stuff. So we're trying to get them an early introduction to that, to figure out why somebody had a question, who is assessor of property, why those things matter. But in my upper division courses, and I teach a class on civil rights policy, the presidency, municipal politics. In my upper division courses, I'm very aggressive about getting them engaged in the broader terrain of community work, and that can entail everything from voter registration to what does it mean when you have to call someone who's not able to vote because of a incarceration record and their phone doesn't work, their phone number doesn't work. How do you go back and find who that person is in order to let them know about different rules and regulations that have occurred? And then, even things around community-based redistricting. We had a redistricting project that we had through the National Conference of Black Political Scientists. We had 8 universities that were part of this, and including my university. And we had students drawing maps, giving presentations at various meetings, and those kinds of things. So we're trying to really give students a holistic understanding of why the vote matters, and trying to add a critical consciousness to that understanding as well. And again, I'm fortunate enough, because my last comment is that I integrate this in all of my courses, maybe with one course. Number 2 is that we do have an experiential learning component on campus that does recognize students at graduation for being part of an experiential learning program. And then number 3, in my department of political science, our department chair about a decade or so ago created a community-based research practicum that allows students to actually work for an organization to do this kind of work for credit.
That's great. Elizabeth Benyon wanted to say a real quick follow-up to those 2 comments.
Yeah, I think it's really important to think about how we can integrate it into the classroom. That's the way to really capture student attention, get students involved. And I think this is great what Sekou is doing about integrating it into the classrooms. It might sound impossible to do because you have so much curriculum to cover. I'll put something in the chat that is just a quick and easy way to add civic action projects to any class, but if they could start small, like observing a few public meetings, writing a letter to the editor, researching a federal rule change, et cetera. But the other thing is about connecting it to issues that students care about. Melissa mentioned this, but what I was really struck by at that Student Vote Research Network meeting was changing up those class presentations and not going in with, do we do a civic duty message, or do we do a close election message? Or, do we do if you don't vote, young people won't be listened to message? That none of those might work if they really don't care about either person at the top of the ticket. So really asking them what issues they care about, and then explaining what level of government handles those can really be a much better approach. So one of the things we also did this year was to have a down ballot forum with all the candidates and the incumbents for things like surveyor and treasurer and coroner. And folks got passionate because a person's husband or son had been killed. And she is convinced, Young Turks are convinced, a lot of people are convinced that it was a racially motivated killing. And instead it was ruled a suicide. And so seeing like how important it is that the coroner gets it right and how it can affect people's lives was amazing for people. And so drawing some attention to those races, I think, can be critical, but especially those state and county now with book bans, and debates over mask mandates, et cetera, school boards, all of that comes in. Do we talk about race? How do we talk about race? You know, there are things that are getting students more interested in those local races that they used to think, oh, I don't even care about these and I shouldn't think about them until I'm older. I think it's sort of a opportune time to get students involved and engaged in all of the election cycles, not just thinking about the presidency.
Okay, another question. So in my own civic engagement work, I've really come to the realization, especially with my work with women in politics, that we really have to tailor these civic engagement activities to our students and to our communities, which are increasingly diverse. And so how do we integrate an intersectional approach and give students what they truly need? How do we make sure that our students' lived experiences and what they're struggling with in terms of, how we encourage them to participate? Sometimes we say things that might fall on deaf ears if we don't consider where they're coming from. And so this question, my volunteers to answer this question were Melissa and Sekou. So I'm going to start with Melissa and then once again come back to Sekou.
I feel like I'm repeating myself a little bit, but I think it starts with listening to the students. And Menlo College is an extremely diverse campus. We're both an HSI and an NAPC. A third of our students are first gen. And what I've found in my work is that for a lot of these students, they're actually acting as knowledge brokers. This is also something we talked about last week, but that especially for students of color and first generation students, they're not getting the political socialization from home, but in fact, they're getting the political socialization on campus, and then they're bringing that home to their families and to their communities. And emphasizing that and empowering students and giving them messages about how actually they are knowledgeable and they are powerful and they can serve in this capacity is a way of also boosting their civic engagement and kind of their pride in like, yeah, and I'm going to help get my family to vote and I'm going to help get my community to vote. And that is a powerful way, not just to get students involved, but to have these spillover effects that make the efforts even more valuable. And so I think we need to think about the different kinds of students we have on campus. And sure, some of them, are from families where voting is a family affair, and you get together at Sunday dinner and you go through the ballot together, and then you all go vote together, and it's a big deal. And some folks are the only ones in their family who are engaged at all. And so they're going to need different kinds of motivation. So I think we just have to think about that, and we have to know our students. And obviously, we all are coming from very different campus communities and very different cultures, but we know that, right? We know that, we're at a liberal arts college or a community college or an HBCU, and we're serving those students. And we can't just take this, passed down knowledge of one size fits all. And we can all do that.
Absolutely. Sekou, something to add?
Yeah, well, I guess I would answer it several ways, and I'll just attach to my university. A good number of my students commute to campus, and they're commuting sometimes 30 or 60 minutes away. My campus is in a place called Rutherford County, which is adjacent to Nashville, and then there are other rural counties. So students are coming from all over. We have no public transit system in the city of Murfreesboro. It's hard for students to get around if they don't have a car, or if they're located, if they're trying to get to community activities. So what we try to do is we try to build out civic engagement activities that are flexible to where students are. So for example, if we're doing if I'm doing a voter registration drive, I'll take one day and do it in class. If I'm asking students to observe a county commission or do court watch, then I'll craft it where they can do it in Murfreesboro, or they can do it in Wilson County or Williamson County or Davidson County, wherever they are from. So I create a lot of flexibility and a time span, maybe a 6 to 8 week time span for them to complete the activity, so they can do it in a geographic area. And then a good number of our students work 40 hours. And sometimes we're working that Friday to Sunday, 40-hour split, to get paid for campus, pay for college and so forth. So trying to create enough flexibility in that schedule where they can, and we're talking about a good number of our students, not like 10%, but probably a good 40% of our students. But I also think in terms of civic engagement, what I try to do is I often will stay away from the term civic engagement because it kind of reinforces American pluralism and safety, and it doesn't look at intersectional issues, it doesn't look at inequality. So a good number of my students, we're trying to put them in settings where they have to challenge democratic notions, they have to challenge pluralism. They're going to figure out, what does it mean we were just at a committee hearing last week, and what does it mean if you are incarcerated, formerly incarcerated, and you got to get a bill through a legislative committee in which 80% of the legislative committee people are white men. And so they're going to try to get a sense of what that appears like. So we're trying to not necessarily, in terms of my courses, impose upon the students, but we're trying to put them in settings, intersectional settings, so to speak. Settings where there's inequality, settings where there's a countervailing force trying to move systems, and have them observe the settings, whatever conclusion that they want to come to. It's kind of up to them with some interrogation, but we're trying to put them in settings where they can kind of see how groups that have their backs against the wall are trying to essentially expand this idea of democracy and engage folks. And so that's the best way I can answer that question.
No, I appreciate, it's knowing your students, right? I appreciate both of those were really grounded in, listening, being aware, knowing your community, and even to the point of knowing that the term civic engagement or civility or deliberation can be off-putting to your students. And sometimes we have to reframe, the language that we use. Really valuable points.
If I could add that, if we bring in lawmakers into Murfreesboro, into Middle Tennessee State University on a panel of civic engagement, most of those lawmakers, all of them, in fact, are going to embrace civic engagement. Well, those are the same lawmakers that are passing legislation, locking folks up, that are telling students that they can't vote. So interrogating what this term civic engagement means for people's backs against the wall is part of what my involvement in civic engagement.
Yeah. There's a lot of women in politics and feminist scholars that say the same thing about the language, right? That they use different language to refer to activism, which leads to voting, but not the traditional language that we have used in political science. So know your students is a great point. Okay, so the next question that I have is, my goodness, the political environment is changing so quickly. I did a project on rude politics and how it was affecting students with Elizabeth, like right before the pandemic. And now it's like, what, now we need to what's misinformation, propaganda, the escalation of violence. I feel like what's the civic skill set that we need to prepare our students with? Like, how do we prepare them as all of these things are changing and change what we do for our civic engagement pedagogy? And so the two volunteers to answer this question, at least to start us off, were Marcus and then Elizabeth. So I'll start with Marcus. So we haven't heard from you in a while, and then we'll pop back to Elizabeth.
Thank you. I want to echo a lot of what Sekou and what Melissa and what Elizabeth and Connie have been saying, that it has to be bigger than just, are you voting and have you done your civic duty? That there's a wide range of engagement in politics that people need to be practicing in order to be effective citizens. And to Sekou's most recent point, when we're asking people to be engaged at every step in the way and putting the onus on them for things that elected officials should be being more responsible for, then we're kind of missing the elephant in the room, which is to say there is a concerted effort by elected officials to contest, at least, a lot of the general public will that people are trying to express in their elections. And so when our students come to us and tell us, hey, I don't want to engage in this vote or in this election because, reasons A, B, and C, I think it's incumbent upon us to listen to them and to be able to encourage them that voting is one of the ways, and one of the very important and bedrock foundational ways, that they can be engaged in the political process, but it can't be the only one. And if it is the only one, they're actually doing themselves a disservice by leaving that responsibility to others. To this point that you raised, Cherie, on uncivility or rudeness, I wrote in, I think a few of us might have written in this More Than Red and Blue report for APSA and Protect Democracy. My co-author was Kenesha Grant. We talked about evolutionary and revolutionary social movements. So we're already focusing on the way that politics work outside of the electoral process, but also that it is engaging that process. I also just submitted an article called Killing Them with Kindness about the anti-democratic and counter-revolutionary impact of uncontentious politics. So basically, like my book, Invisible Weapons in 2022, we basically find that when you tell people that there's a very constrained way that they can engage in politics, then they actually become disempowered. They actually become silenced in a lot of ways, particularly when you're talking to people coming from marginalized communities. When you tell them there's a right way to do things and that that right way is so narrow that they don't see themselves in the process or the outcome, then you actually end up doing a disservice to them. And so I want to talk about how we can't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Yes, we need to attack and end fascism, but we also need to do so without it coming at the expense of silencing the groups that we have always silenced. I think the last thing I'd say, more specifically to your point about the civic skill set, is I don't think it's really changed. I think they need to know how to advocate for themselves. And they haven't really been taught, because that means more headaches for universities attempting to kind of run their race without interference. And so I think we'll continue to fail students and ourselves if we're silencing and displacing them. And I think we need to focus on more holistic ways of engagement, which very, very happily this entire panel has been doing.
And thank you so much. I think I do see the need for information literacy, digital literacy, and recognizing logical fallacies. I think it's always been important, but because so many politicians and other political actors now have completely taken off the guardrails in terms of what's acceptable, including things like hypocrisy, which is politics has always been rife with hypocrisy, but now somebody will say on camera one day something, an hour later on camera the exact opposite thing without blinking, right? And then with deep fakes and with intentional misinformation, disinformation spreading more quickly. Again, it's always existed, but our students, I think, are seeing so much more of it. I think that's the one thing that we're realizing as colleges and universities, and hopefully as K through 12 institutions, we really need to give our students those skills to both embed critical thinking courses that really interrogate like what's a claim versus an evidence-based claim, and what are good sources of evidence. So information literacy and critical thinking courses into the curriculum, as well as specific sort of digital literacy that, you know, when the fact checkers at Princeton get it wrong because they're using traditional critical thinking skills to read an article that's just a good fake, but the professional fact checkers get it right by using sort of lateral reading and doing a reverse image search and having multiple browsers open to see where did this really get copied from. That they need a different set of tools there, perhaps just because it has proliferated through social media online. And so that's what I see us doing on our campus and many other campuses, is having workshops and also embedding those skills within general education to try to help students have that ability to not be quite so easily fooled. Although, of course, all of us can be guilty of confirmation bias, where we simply don't check as much if it's something that we agree with, right? And so teaching them about the different forms of bias is helpful too. And there are some nice websites I can just throw in the chat that are helpful that you can share with students.
Thank you. So we need to do everything from voting to disruptive politics and nonviolent civil disobedience to misinformation and how to identify propaganda, right? All of it. That's what we have to do now. Okay. Check, check, check. We're just going to all use Elizabeth's resources to do this well. So this is a question that lots of people wanted to jump on. You know, sort of just that last conversation makes us realize how much time this takes and how passionately people are approaching this work. in saying you need to know your students and your community, that even that in and of itself takes time, right? It's much harder than coming in and giving, sort of a canned lecture. So one of the things that we've struggled with over time, people doing this work, I've been doing this work for, 20 years now. How do we intersect this work with our need for retention, tenure, and promotion? How do we build this into our case that we are a good professor, that we deserve to be retained at the university, that we deserve those merit bumps and those the promotions that secure us tenure, so that we can have good colleagues doing this work all the time. So here I'm going to start with Connie, because I haven't heard from you in a while, and I know you had some things to say, and then we'll circle back to Melissa, and then Marcus and Elizabeth again.
Okay, I teach at a community college, and we don't have tenure per se, right? You get a 1 year, then a 3 year, then a 5-year contract. A 5-year contract is essentially tenure, but you can still lose your job. So I don't have that problem, but every year we have to be evaluated, and then at the end of our contract, there's sort of a super evaluation, right? And because of the Civic Sense plan, everybody can use civic engagement kind of work to be evaluated. So if somebody can get credit for making a civic engagement course, somebody can get credit for hosting a voter drive, somebody can get credit for their club doing X, Y, and Z. So I really like that, because it's acknowledging the work that you have to do for it, and it's also acknowledging the importance of the work, right? That it's just part of what we're expected to do and what we can get credit for doing, for promotions and so on and so forth. Yes, the work counts for teaching and service. Absolutely, it does. And once again, I'm really happy and proud of that at this school. I think in terms of a research agenda, I also, again, I work at a community college where we are more likely to teach than do research. In fact, we're not really required to do much research. Because I'm director of this program, I only teach half time. So I've been able to do some research, but it's been, well, and actually I should say that some of my colleagues who teach classes have used this work as research for their publications. But we have a long way to go there here at Piedmont. So, but I just love the lack of tenure idea, that we get to have all these opportunities, and our faculty do take advantage of them. That was kind of windy and long, or
Melissa.
So I have published on some of this work, and I know Elizabeth has as well. But what I want to throw out there for everyone is there's really not a lot. There's a lot of stuff that we consider best practices that we just kind of know, like, yes, of course, this is the way to do it. Of course, this is working. But we don't know in terms of, we don't have robust, peer-reviewed, published work about it. And so there's an enormous amount of space in this area for folks to do something with what they're doing at their campus, to do an RCT, to do focus groups and survey data collection, to compare what they're doing to maybe what another school is doing and do some sort of collaborative work. I would love to see more published work on what works at community colleges, because of course a lot of the work that we have is not from community colleges, because those professors don't have the same pressures to publish. But there's a lot of stuff to be proven, to be tested, to be explored. And just because we know something worked before doesn't mean we know it works now, because as we've been talking about, things are really changing. Student attitudes about voting are changing. And so there's an enormous amount of space to do this. Also, I think there's a very strong argument to be made within your institution, not only that it counts towards service in terms of helping your students become civically engaged, but we know that students who are civically engaged are also probably going to be more likely to stay in college, to stay on track to graduation. And if you can link the work that you're doing to student academic success, then that's again something you can put in your reports and your dossiers and say, here's how I'm helping the students, here's how I'm helping the institution in terms of keeping our students on track and getting them their degrees on time. So I would emphasize that in anything that you're pitching to your deans. If your dean doesn't happen to be a political scientist, maybe they're a physicist and they need a little bit more convincing, but there's some great evidence out there that Unsolve has been promoting and that you can kind of, quote from their reports to support those points.
Marcus.
Yeah, I just want to acknowledge Melissa and Elizabeth, who are doing great in the chat right now. So if you're not there and looking at a lot of the information they're sharing, definitely check that out. I kind of want to look at this a bit more from the institutional or university kind of point of view. And so I do think that we are in position, we're incentivized to make sure that everything we do is something that counts. And, as someone who is, maybe 2 years into being tenured, I do recognize the importance of making sure that your work is not happening in vain with respect to your job, the thing that allows you to put food on the table. And I think one of the ways that you want to do that is definitely to be in touch with administrators. So if you can talk to your dean for sure, or whoever in that capacity, I think it would be a really important thing to do. As one of my students said a while back, you want to dig your well before you need water. And so I think beyond that, though, I also, I've been working with young people for 20 years now. Don't ask how old I am. If you're unfulfilled by that work, maybe and you're a professor, maybe you should go be a consultant. Maybe you should go work for a think tank. Maybe this just isn't necessarily the place for you. But for me, I know that when I was an assistant professor, it was something that was deeply fulfilling. It was deeply motivating. Now, for me, it has been kind of a sacred space. And so I haven't published, although I don't forego that possibility. And I completely agree with you, Melissa, that that is something that is important that we do need to be talking about. But in those spaces, I think the priority is about care, it's about community, it's about commitments to a better future every day in every way. And so there's this idea that I know I felt when I was, younger, and I know my students feel sometimes, that we're only important to certain people when an election is coming around. And I think there is an emphasis that we need to make on ourselves, an onus that we have, that if we want people to be responsive to our calls, our pleading with them to be engaged in these processes, then they have to matter as people and not just as a potential voter. And I don't think we can say that enough. I think it's really easy as faculty to see our students as folks, we interact with, who get sometimes strange emails, who sometimes read the syllabus, et cetera, et cetera. But the reality is that their lives are bigger than just what they experience at the university, and they're bigger than what we realize they experience at the university. And so I would really, really reiterate the strength and importance of connecting with people on a more human level. And if that's not your strength, practice, because you get a new crop of students every semester.
Elizabeth.
Oh my goodness, that's so wonderful. Okay, that is inspiring. So I will say, for me, the biggest piece of advice is know what kind of campus you're on. Some kind of campuses, it might not count. You may be lucky to be able to count the types of multi-campus randomized field experiments with hundreds of thousands of students and dozens of campuses that I did with my colleague David Nickerson, and that might be the extent of what they might even potentially count. Or maybe that didn't place because political behavior and PS political science and politics aren't the AJPS or the APSR, and it still doesn't count, right? Depending on what kind of institution you're at, trying to go that traditional route may or may not work. For me, I'm at a regional campus of a public university at Indiana University, and so we can pursue excellence in teaching, research, or service, although they encourage you not to pursue service for tenure, though it's acceptable for promotion to full professor. So I'm at an institution that values teaching and research and service, and particularly values combining those. The reason that I'm a chancellor's professor, that I've run sort of system-wide awards in service and in teaching, is because that idea of combining those things is valued at my institution. It's not at every institution. So that is really important to think about and know about. One for me personally, is a question of, does it count towards teaching and service? Have you been able to write and publish? Sheree had asked us to think about. So for me, yes, because I got a course release and some budget and grants and interns, I was able to do this work and build it into my schedule. So that was critically important. When the institution looked at taking away the stipend and the course release, I was ready to walk away from the project, which they didn't want to happen. So it is important to make sure that you have time to do the work. In my case, it has been very productive. I've had some recognition from professional institutions like ASCU and NACAPSA and Campus Compact, local awards from League of Women Voters, Chamber of Commerce, our city council, the MLK Foundation, and a variety of campus awards, alumni association awards, plus books, edited books, book chapters, edited collections of work, and some double-blind peer-reviewed journals in political science, journals for some of the larger randomized control trials. So for me, it's been a perfect way to bring together something I'm passionate about, my teaching, my research, my service, my one-on-one mentoring of students, to be successful and to be one of the better known people on campus and in the community, because I was at an institution that valued the work. And so I do think it very much depends where you are, what your job responsibilities are, and what your institution values.
That's, I mean, important advice on both sides. Find ways to be passionate about your work with students, have conversations with people on campus, and understand your campus values as you're putting your case together. For some of us, I was able, I'm going to sneak in with my own little comment as moderator, take a little privilege. I did some publication work with Elizabeth earlier in my career, and I was able to carve out time and space to do that because I was at a regional public where a scholarship of teaching and learning piece or a pedagogy piece that was well researched, right, but was about the effects of experiential learning or different programs on campus, was acceptable and valued as a research publication. And that's why I got the job. My work doing that sort of thing is the reason why, when I applied to be director of an institute that focuses on applied politics, right, both running for office, but also sort of applied citizenship work, I had a better resume than someone who hadn't been doing, right, that work, maybe at a more research intensive that wouldn't have counted that thing. So your career can come together in weird ways, but just make sure that you do whatever you need to do to stay in your positions, because we want you there as colleagues doing this work. So just figure that out for yourself. One of the things I also wanted to ask, I am just so impressed by how far we've come across the course of my career in welcoming and valuing this work, in our work to help people have these conversations and get credit for it. Elizabeth and I co-founded a consortium years ago, on hiatus during the pandemic, but I'm going to try to bring it back at the Bliss Institute to help other people, not just ourselves, do multi-campus research, right? If that's something you need to do to get tenure, we want to help facilitate that so that people can stay. But we had to be very conscious and think about, right, how do we help people continue to do this work, because we wanted colleagues like all of you in the room with us. So the one question I have as we start to close this out is, and here my volunteers were Marcus and Elizabeth again, what more could APSA and our discipline do, if anything? Right, we've come so far, but what more can we do to support scholars like yourself who are prioritizing this work? How do we take it even further and make this integral? And an assumption is that we should be doing this work, not that you have to make an argument for it. How do we carry that forward? So we'll start with Marcus and then come back to Elizabeth.
Sure. So obviously resources are always helpful. So grants and fellowships, things of that nature are always great. The thing that I like to focus on a lot is network building. And so I think APSA is really centrally located. I think it's in a position to be able to connect people, much like how we all are connected today, right? Some of us are meeting for the first time. I think that work is vital. Even for your last question about how we engage in the work to achieve tenure status or to challenge the discipline that, in my experience, is pretty conservative broadly, right? And so depending on what university you're at. But to be able to find your people, I know for me, it was only after I published my book that I ran into folks like Diva Woodley and Hari Han who were doing similar work. And I thought, wow, though I did well with the book and awards and good stuff, it would have only been better had I been able to connect with those people beforehand. And so I think building that type of community, again, we also are people. We also matter outside of elections. So building those types of connections are really important no matter what stage of our career we're at. And particularly though for our junior scholars. And I think APSA has the capacity to do that. I think I'd also add, I do a lot of work with an organization called Not Me We in Chicago. They're a tenant advocacy organization, among other things. They do a lot of school work. They do a lot of community development work. They're pushing an Obama community benefits agreement right now to try and keep people living in their neighborhoods as the neighborhood develops. This type of work going inside and outside the academy is going to continue to be important. And so I think, I'm working at Howard, I'm working at Howard towards a Center for Community Organizing and Democracy, but figuring out ways that we can integrate these universities, which are very much like modern cities, to have a big political stake in our society today, and trying to do work both within and beyond them and making those connections. So I think APSA could help with that type of work as well.
Yes, absolutely. I think the teaching civic engagement books that APSA has published is a step forward. I think having a civic engagement section and a political science education section that has long championed the work through the Teaching and Learning Conference, the standalone and APSA, TLC at APSA is useful, where it's always a major interest of participants and gives people a chance to gather. So I think the APSA Educate platform is great, where we can share ideas, and once they go up on APSA Educate, it's really easy to share through social media with other folks who might be interested in what you're doing, and they're short enough that we can fit reading them quickly into our busy schedules. So I think all of that is useful. I'd love to see space and place for folks from the Student Vote Research Network to gather at APSA, as well as we have gathered before MPSA the last couple of years, and just more broadly, maybe some informal networking spaces and dine-arounds for folks who are interested in learning from each other about doing this work and considering all of the types of issues that we're discussing today. I'd love to hear from the participants and what questions they have, what ideas they have at some of these larger networking events, whether virtual, but also at the meetings. That connection that Marcus was talking about, I think, is critically important.
Melissa also wanted in on this question.
Well, Elizabeth kind of alluded to it, but I think one of the valuable things about the meeting at the Midwest was that we were able to give people financial support to come. And so we did have a lot of participation by community college faculty and by practitioners. And so if APSA is able to provide that kind of support, maybe for the next SVRN meeting in Chicago, maybe at the APSA meeting in the future, but if we want folks like Connie and Sharon Boyd-Peshkin to come and share with us what they're doing at community colleges, which serve way more students than those of us at four-year places do, given what their jobs are like and how they differ from ours, they need that financial support to come, and they need to be brought in and welcomed into our communities more than I think we generally do. And I would love to see that kind of support come from APSA.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I'm learning so much about, I've been doing this for a long time, but I'm like learning about networks and things that I would like, and people that I would like to connect to. So even just on this this webinar. So this has been really helpful. In closing, before we move on to question and answer, I have a few questions. And if you have questions, please post them, right? I'm tracking the question and answers, and I have a few. But the last thing I wanted to do was just in closing, like, what did I miss? Is there something that I didn't ask, or something about the work that you're doing on your campus, or the things that you're publishing that you want to share? Maybe we'll go in reverse order this time and start with Melissa and work our way backwards alphabetically, since we started that way the other time. Anything else that I missed?
No, I think I'm happy with everything I said, and everyone should please go to the Student Vote Research Network and check out the Substacks there.
Connie.
Oh, I don't really have a lot to add, but I would like to reinforce the APSA needs to pay more attention to community colleges, not just as people who need help teaching.
Yeah.
We get that a lot from APSA. And treat us more like real professors and include us a little bit more. Other than that, I'm good.
Okay. Sekou.
Yeah, I think that, a lot of times with civic engagement, or I don't know, we are filling a structural hole in communities that, many of our organizations and networks of activists are resource poor. And oftentimes when we engage with community folks, we're assisting with resources in ways that there's no money, there's very few staff, they're going up against gigantic mountains of opposition and oppression. And so just to keep in mind that we're also feeling a structural hole of resources that's missing when it comes to engagement.
Marcus.
Yeah, this has been great, and thank you, and I appreciate your time. As I said earlier, I'll be working with Howard University TV on Before You Vote. I'll also be working with a group called Hype Plus on the importance of Black voters. I think one of the things that we haven't necessarily acknowledged, and not that we have had this problem, but there is a way that we kind of vote shame people in past elections. It has been very effective on some level. But in the midst of a genocide, it's just not going to work this time. I think it's important to not try and take a moral high ground or tell people that they're strategically deficient or they're just not intelligent enough to be engaged, which is kind of what we do sometimes when people tell voters or potential voters that they just don't know what's best for them. So I want to talk to people, acknowledge the trade-offs, be honest, and empower them to work collectively towards a future that they have a place in. So
Thank you.
that's what I got.
Elizabeth.
I think one thing that all of our, or most of our communities need are more poll workers and younger poll workers. In our county, the average poll worker is 72 years old. So we've partnered with the local county clerk to do a robust poll worker recruitment and training program. She did get a federal grant to do this work. So it's a great partnership. And I think that clerks across the country need this. And working with our local elected officials and county clerk's office is important. And this is true across party lines. Unfortunately, in many communities, that's a partisan position. Sometimes it's a controversial position. I would say there was a very controversial election in which our clerk came to power. My whole notion with that, and with any of the other politicians I deal with, is that's not what I'm interested in. I just need students to hear where they stand and they can make up their own minds. Similarly with election officials, they may have their own election reasons for working with you that people want to tell you about. I just can't be concerned with that, whether it helps them or with some re-election campaign and someone gets upset with that. That's not my goal. That shouldn't be our goal. In our positions at the university. And so I think just building those tight relations across party lines with local elected officials so that they're not advertently or inadvertently disenfranchising students, right? And that you're building that positive relationship with those local election administrators can be really important and in getting our students involved in other ways than only as voters. And then, as Marcus said, and everybody I think has highlighted, keeping them engaged between election cycles and recognizing that voting, while very important, is not the ultimate goal, that we'd like them to be engaged much more broadly.
Okay, I'm going to switch over to some of the questions that came in from the audience now, and picking and choosing. The one that I thought was really interesting first, that came up earlier in the thread, was one of our audience members is seeing a drop off in graduate student voting. And that's actually a finding that Elizabeth and I had from an earlier multi-campus questionnaire that we administered on, I think it was 36 campuses across the US, was that the longer people were on a college campus, the less likely they were to engage in and participate and to vote. It was a survey, so we don't have the answer about why, but we speculated that they just got busier and further away from these socializing experiences, where we're pulling them in, where they have that freshman year experience class, or they're taking that first civic engagement course requirement, or their intro to political science. So does anybody have ideas about how we can grab up the upper level students and the graduate students on our campuses? Is anyone doing anything about that?
I can jump in.
Yeah, please.
I know I'm beating a dead horse, but it does matter if you support student organizing and student groups. It's one of those things that pays itself off many-fold, but the reality is we need to put students in a position to advocate for themselves and teach them how to advocate for themselves. And that requires us being active. It's very easy to kind of, at this stage of all of our respective careers, to kind of distance ourselves from our graduate experience. Maybe it's healthier to do that. Whatever, we're not going to go down that road. But I was at University of Chicago. We typically last a lot longer than 5 years, right? And so being engaged and active in the city is a very important part of lasting in a place for a decade, a place that I now call home. And so I think teaching students at that stage, whether it's grad or undergrad or junior faculty, right? Like if we want our junior faculty to be engaged and involved, then we have to have our grad students engaged and involved. We need to have our undergrads engaged and involved, because we need to teach them that this is actually what a full life looks like. And I think there may be some pipeline questions about who goes to graduate school, and not yes, the typical kind of marginalization conversations, but also the conversations about how we select students and how we select the students with the best GPAs, who treat you the best, who are engaged as RAs, but maybe don't have necessarily the type of social engagement that would benefit someone in these processes. So if we are selecting students who are particularly disengaged with the world, but really engaged with our classes, we're kind of reinforcing this problem. And I think we have some power here to be able to affect that process.
Anyone else? That's a great answer. Yeah, I think I would just say, circling back also to cultivating the civic, we focus so much on voting. I teach a civic engagement class where we talk about the cultivation of civic identity, or the disposition. Or this is also my answer to legislators when they come to me and say, like, what are you doing? Are you brainwashing students? And, I'm like, I don't want to chase them around with a stick or a cattle prod after they leave. I don't want a secret social media thread somewhere telling my students how to vote. I want them to become the kind of people that want to vote on their own, right? And that have internalized the importance of being consistently participatory. And so maybe we need to focus just as much on civic identity cultivation, and following Melissa's advice, what are identifying true best practices for doing that, not scolding them, not what we think will work, so that they have that intrinsic identity and it lasts, as opposed to just the voter registration drives. We just need to do everything, right? Okay, so I had another question that takes us in a completely different direction in terms of the age spread. We had a question about resources for people who are partnering with elementary and middle schools. So does anyone know of resources for elementary and middle schools if you have students going out in the community and trying to help with those kinds of students? No, Elizabeth nodded her head, but didn't unmute. So
Civics has some really great interactive games that you can play with them, or they can play on their own, that are sort of video game type style of all sorts of civics related topics. So I think they're great to check out. The Constitution Center, in terms of getting at what are some of these big issues that students care about, what are their rights, starting to develop that civic identity, can be really useful because they hold courses and have curriculum. They host things in person, but they also have a lot online now, and they're developing curriculum that folks can kind of plug and play pieces of regarding the Constitution, and recognizing the various controversies and who the Constitution was and wasn't written to protect. So I think their information is getting a lot more sophisticated, a lot more appropriate for diverse K through 12 settings. And so those are two places that come to mind.
yeah, one of the things I'm noticing throughout the thread, and Janet Donovan actually has a comment specific to this. I'm just going to read it out for her. They also noticed that their grad students were not participating, and they're just adding, I mean, first step, right? You add the information to orientation, right? Add the information to your grad student orientation. How simple is that? It might not completely solve the problem, but at least when they move to a new town, if they're funded student and shifting where they live, they get all the information that they need to register the vote, the same way that we do with an intervention in an undergraduate classroom. That's a great, simple, great suggestion. One of the things that I'm seeing throughout the thread is a deep appreciation for all the resources that are being shared in the thread and for all the suggestions about networking. And then this leads me back to that question and the suggestions for APSA, and I know that APSA is, recently trying to reconnect with K through 12 and think about this, reconnecting more, organically, right, with our community college partners, our K through 12 partners, specifically around issues of civic engagement. So more resources. I think what we're hearing is a call for way more resources from all of us on APSA Educate that will serve the discipline and everyone who's reaching out and starting to do this work. So I think that brings us close to where we are supposed to wrap up this webinar. I just want to say, first of all, thank you for all the panelists. Where we have come as a discipline to have all of you share these resources, to see the direction that we're headed, has, just really been a happy spot for me this morning. I appreciate all the information that all of you have shared. I appreciate the fact that we had so many people in the audience today who are looking for ways to effectively do this work on their own campuses. That makes me realize that it's not just, right, it's not just a handful of us sort of trying to dig this trench on our own, right? This is something that we are collectively turning our attention to as a discipline. And I'm so happy that APSA had the idea to have this webinar, which is also an indication of where our discipline, not just my colleagues, but the discipline writ large, is headed. So we're going to end this webinar. I know there's lots of things that we could be upset and concerned about in the world today, but I think we're going to end this webinar on a happy note because I feel like there's so many of us, fighting this good fight together, and I appreciate all of you. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.